Scripture for the message is Luke 6, verses 1 through 11. On a Sabbath, while Jesus was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what it is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those with him. And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Now on another Sabbath he entered the synagogue, and he was teaching. A man was there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees watched him closely to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." He rose and he stood there. Jesus said to them, "I asked you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy?" And after looking around at them all, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with folly, and they discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. I was remembering back this week to, I know I was little, probably somewhere around 6 years old, and was in church. All the adults were either having some meeting or they were eating a potluck, and us kids went upstairs and we started playing around. It had to have been cold or rainy, because otherwise we'd go outside, but we were all running around in the church playing hide and seek. And eventually we made our way into the sanctuary. And pews are a very good place to hide underneath, so I remember back in that day. And we even went up in the choir loft, and I was hiding under there too. Well, when I got home that evening, my parents sat me down and they said that you're never supposed to go past this altar rail here. That wasn't for anybody but the minister to go past. I figured some adult must have seen us and told our parents what had happened. So I didn't understand the answer my parents gave as to why we weren't supposed to go there. It had something to do about honoring God. But they always told me that God was everywhere. So what difference does it make whether you're just on that side or just on this side about how that honors God to me in some particular place? I was young enough, it just really didn't make any sense to me. And of course, my parents didn't just come up with that rule. I think it had been handed down for a while, never written, but just probably custom that people had. And I realized as I was thinking this week, that was probably my first encounter with someone taking God's work and turning it into a rule. Now, this is something that a lot of people do. In fact, some people would turn all of the gospel, all of God's work, all of the Bible into a rule book. Here's the rules. Don't do these things. People that do them are going to violate these rules, will pay the consequence. Whenever we come up with that idea of a rule book, we forget that the greatest rule, Jesus said, was to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And that every other rule or commandment could be summed up in love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said that often. God wants us to honor each other, not just honor rules for their own sake. His law is always a law of love. That's what our text, I think, is lifting up for us here. As we look back and remember in the Old Testament, God's work for his people involved a particular rule that said honor or observe or remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And holy meant like separate. And part of what keeping it holy was to not work, not treat it like every other day of the week when we did work. And so the Israelites were told not to work on those days. Now by Jesus' time, instead of honoring people by honoring the Sabbath, they instead had turned it into honoring a rule. And in fact, they had come up with hundreds of other rules to explain what work is or isn't on the Sabbath, so that people would know to do or not do something to make sure they were honoring the Sabbath in the right way. And so we come up with two episodes here in Jesus' ministry where we see that he doesn't honor rules for their own sake, but he honors people. In the first one, his disciples are hungry as they're walking through the wheat fields. They pluck the heads of wheat, they rub them in their hands so they can separate the wheat from the chaff so they can eat the grain. Now, that doesn't sound like much of anything, except that one of those hundreds of rules that defined what work was said that if you rub something in your hands to produce something, that was work. And so Pharisees happened to be seeing this, and they asked Jesus, "Why do you do what it is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And that phrase at the end, "on the Sabbath," literally could be translated "to the Sabbath." Why do you do what it is not lawful to do to the Sabbath? So for them, it's like the Sabbath has become an end in itself. Like, how can you do this to the Sabbath? You know, it can't be treated that way. It has to be treated better than that. And so their goal is not honoring others, but honoring a thing, a particular day. So Jesus has to point out to them, he said, "Don't you remember back in the older times, David and his men, they were on a journey fleeing Saul, and they needed food for that journey? They went in and they ate the tabernacle bread, which was lawful only for the priest to eat. And yet God didn't blame them or condemn them for eating that bread because they needed it in order to stay safe from Saul as he was trying to kill them." And so he concludes then that he, as the Son of Man, is Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath isn't a thing to impose upon people or over people, but it's something to be in service to people. Now the second episode is even worse. It's another Sabbath, and Jesus is in the synagogue. There's a man there whose right hand is withered. The scribes and the Pharisees, it says, were watching him closely, that they might find something to accuse Jesus. So they're just looking at him intently with the intention of just finding something that's going to get Jesus in trouble. Jesus knows their hearts. He tells the man to stand up in the midst of them all. And then he asks the leaders, what is more honorable on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save a soul or to destroy it? And he looks around at all of them. And not one will answer the right answer. It's better to help people than to hurt them, because their hearts are so hardened and they're so intent on just doing something against Jesus. So he has to tell the man, stretch out your hand. And as the man stretches it out, it's restored. And he's healed. But then we're told the leaders are full of folly. And they're discussing what they would do to Jesus. Their honoring the Sabbath was at the expense of people, not in service to people. They would rather have a person not be healed because of this so-called honor for a thing, for a day. That's going to dishonor the Sabbath. We can't do that. So it's accurate that Luke says that their minds are full of folly. Today we see that same dynamic not only in something real comparable, like someone honoring the church building and the parts within the building over against honoring people and worrying too much about the things in the building instead of the people in the building. But more importantly, on a day-to-day level, I think we see this dynamic when we're tempted to turn God's work for us into a set of rules. Now, to me, one way that happens is somebody hurts someone we care about. I want them to pay for how they hurt my spouse or child or loved one. There's rules in the Bible for this, and I'm glad those rules are there because they're going to get what's due to them. So that's the kind of temptation I think it's more common that we could face. And when we start being tempted in that way, we're tempted to forget that God's law is a law of love, and that all his commandments are fulfilled in love God and love our neighbor. Let's hear how a woman named Beth Saadati experienced this. She was a younger mother and had an unusual experience occur. She said it was on Thanksgiving Eve. She was boiling sweet potatoes and mixing baked pumpkin for her pies, and said this was the first year her 14-year-old daughter wouldn't be here with her. Instead of her chattering and trying to help out, there was silence. And so Beth, missing her, wanted to turn on the radio just to have some extra noise. But then the radio played 2 songs that had been sung at her daughter's funeral. And right when she was worrying about that and thinking about it, the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anybody. It was a classmate of her daughter that's from high school. She wouldn't come in, but she held out a flat wooden star. It had been painted yellow, and then from the corners to the middle, there were 5 spokes that all had golden glitter on them. "This is for Jenna's tree," she blurted out. I have to go. My dad's waiting." And she ran out. Beth was surprised to see the normally confident queen of her class trembling, and tears streaming down her cheeks. She must have seen Beth's Facebook post about how they wanted to decorate a Christmas tree in memory of Jenna, and that to ask if people that knew her wanted to, they could decorate an ornament for her. After she left, Beth turned off the stove. She went to her bedroom. She retrieved a small manila folder, and she sat in a rocking chair. In that folder, there was a printed copy of her daughter's computer journal. She turned the pages and got to the next to the last page, and there it was. Jenna had named this girl who had come to the door, and then she had written, "Your social infrastructure, your bullying, is the most hurtful thing anyone could ever come up with. I wanted to be friends with you, but you and your group completely excluded me. And even though it's not exactly your fault that I'm gone now, being kind could have saved my life." Beth was tempted to immediately start thinking of spiritual rules and punishment. I forced myself to breathe deeply. My hurting heart thumped. It's as if she was saying in her heart, "I'm glad this girl will get what's coming to her. I'm glad these rules are there." But as she was thinking that, her eyes, God, I think, had her focus further on down the page, and there was a prayer that Jenna had written. It just started off with "Mom," period. "That is probably the biggest thing I ask for. Please, God, you know how tired she is. Give her a long break. Send people to take some of the burden off her shoulders and give her joy." Beth said tears cascaded down my face. Maybe the girl was guilty of not including Jenna, but I was guilty of being too busy working, too busy with things that no longer seemed so important, too busy to recognize the pain growing inside Jenna's heart. And then she saw the final entry in her daughter's journal. "My family, I love you all so much. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." Beth then realized it wasn't Jenna that she needed to forgive, but in her words, all of those who had intentionally or unintentionally hurt my daughter, just as I have been forgiven by my God, who loved me and gave his life for me. 6 weeks later was January 2nd. It was the 1-year anniversary of her daughter's death. And Beth saw a sign of this new forgiveness. The doorbell rang. It was that same classmate again. She had a dozen yellow roses. These are for Jenna. She looked into my eyes. I looked into hers. She came in and we talked. After 10 minutes, I wrapped my arms around her in an understanding hug. If you ever want to talk, I'll listen. She said she gave a slight smile, and without dismissing the need for change, we were both acknowledging the forgiveness that was real and the healing of 2 broken hearts had begun. Sometimes we're tempted to turn God's work and word into a rule book. Here's the rules. Don't do these things. People will pay for violating the rules. And maybe just like the religious leaders of old, we start honoring the rules for their own sake, instead of honoring people through those rules. We forget that God's law is a law of love, and that there's no greater rule than to love God and neighbor. So may we remember that rules are not meant to impose upon others, but to help us to serve others. And may we always follow the law